Well, hello, I'm Eli. I'm an openly transmasculine and bisexual dude who lives in Leeds and loves books. But I have to admit, I am fairly new to LGBT plus literature, and so this has been very much a journey for me. And yeah, just that.
Hi, I'm Emily. I'm one of the organisers of Leeds LGBT plus book club and the literature festival. I'm a bisexual cisgender woman, and I do other voluntary work and activism in Leeds. And I just, over the last few years since setting the book club up, pretty much queer literature is the only thing that I read.
Hi, I'm Kirsty. I'm a cisgender lesbian. I am one of the organisers of this event. I'm also the secretary for the Leeds LGBT plus book club and a regular attendee. I also really love reading, and I sort of fell into the book club because I was looking for access to more of LGBT plus literature, and it's led to this wonderful event. So it's again another journey.
So as the sort of I guess you could say literature baby of the group, I'm going to be hosting, asking questions from people who are far more knowledgeable than me about it. So I want to start off with asking Emily about setting up the book club. What was that like, and what sort of inspired you to do that?
So I'd already been doing some work in the LGBT community, specifically voluntary work with bi people. And at the same time, I'd been doing a uni course, which meant pretty much everything I read for several years solid was academic work. And when that finished, I suddenly really wanted to read more about people like me, and also read books about other labels and identities that I don't know so much about, to try and learn more about our community outside of the world of bisexuality, really. And I was listening to an event on the radio where they were talking about different books, and I just thought, why is there not something like that for LGBT plus books? I would love that to happen. I'd love that to happen in Leeds. I want that to be something I can attend, where I can have different books recommended to me, read different things I maybe wouldn't pick up usually, and talk about the books that we're reading with other people. So I decided to set the book club up, and that was a few years ago now.
I sort of came into the book club. It was probably quite early on, I think, after you'd set it up. So I'd sort of stumbled across some LGBT plus literature, but just didn't really struggle to understand where I could get more and where I could find it, how to search for it and get what I was actually looking for, which was very similar in wanting to explore different types of authors, different types of books, different genres, and to get some different perspectives, because I felt like I was sort of in a very lesbian sort of focused community, so it was quite nice to try and expand my understanding as well. So I looked up very simply Leeds LGBT plus books, and it popped up. So I joined, and it was great. It was given access to so many different books.
So I guess one of the things that comes up quite a lot when talking about LGBT plus literature is sort of representation, what that means and what matters. And so I wanted to know a little bit about what representation in LGBT plus literature means to you.
So for me, I wanted to start reading LGBT plus literature, particularly at the time when I started to look. I was wanting to read lesbian related literature, and everything that I found, it just didn't quite fit the bill. It didn't feel realistic, or it was not the type of information I was kind of wanting to read. And then I very randomly stumbled across a book by an author called Georgia Beers, who writes lesbian romance fiction. And it was the first time I actually felt like it genuinely felt realistic, like that could have been me, it could have been my friends. It was an actual real life story, you know, and these were real characters that you connected with. And even though I appreciate romance isn't everyone's cup of tea, and it's not the only thing that I like to read, at the time it was like, actually, wow, this is actually a book with characters that are just like me, and I'm not, you know, that's something that they do things and say things that I would do and say. And it sort of was the first time where I actually saw that on page, and I hadn't up until that point. And that's great, being able to have that connection. But I do also think that it's so important to then experience that, but for everybody in the community, so that you're not just looking at those people that are just like you, but also getting to understand other people's perspectives, and to sort of get a taste of their journeys and experiences, which also helps you then to be, I think, more of an ally as well.
Yeah.
So one of the things that's important to me is finding positive bi+ representation in books. The same in movies and TV shows. I find it's often quite rare. It's often not very explicit. Having somebody actually say the B word and talk about the bisexuality and some of the issues is really, really nice to see. And I like that in the book club we've managed to find a few books where that's done really well. I think the books Autobiography and Queens of Geek both talk about the character's bisexuality. They name it as bisexuality, they talk about the issues, but it's also, there's other things that go on in the book. That it is quite a big part of the story, but there's a wider story there as well, and I think that's quite important to have as well, to have that representation there, but also have a good book to read also.
Brilliant. Something there was kind of touched upon about whether a story focuses on LGBT plus themes or whether a character who is incidentally LGBT plus. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that and what your opinions are.
For me, I think both are important. I think it's great to have books, especially where I've seen memoirs, maybe about somebody really exploring their sexuality, or a memoir about their experiences socially and potentially medically transitioning. I think those books are really important, so you can go and read them and get a really good feel for the topic explored. But I also want to be able to read books, especially for me, fiction. I love young adult fiction, and I want to have a really good story that just has queer characters in it, because it feels more lifelike. I think often there's a tendency of books to become quite preachy if they're talking about, this is the issue and this is what homophobia is, this is what transphobia is, this is why it shouldn't be, and it can come across a little bit dry sometimes. And having it in a story in a really natural way, as almost like a little subplot to the main storyline, I that's kind of what I'm looking for most.
I think it's important though when you have those sort of incidental characters where it's just real life. There's main characters, and then there is somebody, and they're in there. They're in the LGBT plus community. They're not a main part of the story. I do think it's quite important the way that person's portrayed, because I've also seen the sort of reverse of that, where actually it wasn't a positive. It felt like it was quite a negative, because the way that they portrayed that person was in a what might be seen to be a very sort of stereotypical way, which isn't necessarily real life, or they're sort of used in a way that just doesn't sit right. You know, they're either killed off early, or hopefully not in a romance or what have you, but you know, sometimes it can be that there is a particular character, and they're almost used to have a situation arise, and that's it, and that's all you really knew about that person. There's nothing else. There's no substance to them, and that can be quite disappointing. So I think it's important to get that balance right.
I guess you could say it's more like using a tool, and a kind of rather 2D tool rather than a 3D fully developed character. I was wanting to ask about what sort of areas, themes, genres, or perhaps communities do you feel are currently underrepresented in LGBT plus literature?
So I think we've definitely seen a lot more diversity in terms of authors and themes, which is great. But I do think there are certain areas that we don't see as much representation for. So in particular, intersex. I think that there are some amazing authors who've written some great books, but it still doesn't feel as though there's a lot to choose from, and that's something that I would love to see more accessible and available and not just from in perhaps as just about intersex people, but perhaps actually again sort of having somebody in their stories actually mentioned at all, because you do tend to see that you often have a gay friend, or there's somebody who is perhaps trans, but I can't think of any books that I've read where there's been any reference to somebody who is intersex.
Yeah.
For me, I feel we're getting more bi representation, but I've very rarely seen people, characters in books identifying as pansexual. I really struggle to find books about people who are asexual as well, so people who don't experience sexual attraction. I find when I've Googled it, I found lots of books that people say the characters are asexual or ace, but it feels the book feels more like the character just doesn't explore that in any way. Are they not having sex because they're asexual, or are they not having sex because it's not a book about that, and it just doesn't happen to happen in the book? And I want to find more books that explores that. It's better represented, and it explores it in a more meaningful way. I also would like to see more books with non-binary characters in, and I feel like the books that I have found tend to cast the non-binary person as an alien, or like some kind of othering of being non-binary, of using maybe different pronouns like they, them, or ze, her, and it's quite difficult to find stories where it's a real life human being.
I think there needs to be a great importance put on the fact that there's a diverse amount of people of all different types in the world, but ultimately and fundamentally still people, and to be treated like people, even within books that are fictional, and to treat people with respect within them.
I also often feel we're lacking intersectionality in books. So we maybe have a book that's a really good book about somebody who's gay or somebody who's trans, but I also want to see those books with characters who are people of colour, who have disabilities.
There's been a lot of debate at the moment about sort of write what you know, compared to trying to have a diverse cast of characters. I want to know sort of what your opinions on this are.
I think that's a bit of a tricky one, isn't it, for a lot of writers, because I think for good authors, they want to ensure that they are inclusive and they are diverse with their characters, but I think that they also want to make sure that they're representing them properly and as you said, respectfully. And so in doing that, there are going to be some characters that they may want to introduce that actually they don't have any lived experiences of. And so there is that sometimes tendency to see that character then portrayed as a very minor part, almost just kind of on the periphery somewhere. And that sometimes isn't it's not helpful to because you don't get to build anything with that character, you don't get to have any connectivity, or so but I can also understand that if you're wanting to make sure that you get it right, you know there can be that fear around bringing a character in too far and perhaps getting something wrong. So I think part of that is actually it's so important to be speaking with other people and talking about their experiences and asking questions where appropriate to do so, so that actually when you're writing these things, you can do that from, you know, with the best of intentions, but also that sort of research to support it, so that then what you're producing is respectful. And then you know, I want to read books where there is a range of people, because that's who we work with, that's who we live with, that's who we are friends with, and that, you know, and I want to see what I have in my life around me in the books that I'm reading.
Yeah, that's a really good answer. I have nothing to add to that.
I think that was a good answer as well.
Yay!
I think there's also this, as well as sort of doing research as well, if you're writing a character different from you, I think there should be a huge importance on, as you're your work, show it and share it with the communities that you are writing about, so that you can get their opinion and their feedback as you are going through the writing process or the editing process.
Yeah, it's really important, isn't it, being able to then, because we're all going to have said things or written things that are not quite right, and I think that was a really, really valid point about speaking to communities, as in, you know, plural, because also I could have Emily could come and ask me, or Eli, you could come and ask me about, you know, what it's like to be a lesbian. Well, I can tell you what it's like for me, but I can't tell you what it's like for any other lesbian. I can only speak to my own experiences, and, you know, the same as that you can speak with anybody, you can't guarantee that is going to be relevant to everybody. So I think it's important to have that range to make sure that it is reflective, and so it might not necessarily resonate with every single person, but it will at least be accurate for some people's experiences.
Definitely.
I think I agree that it's important to go to the community that they're writing about, but I wonder if it's also important to let people know that they've done that. I think at book club, quite a few times, Kirsty, we found people saying, so what about the author? What is their knowledge? What is their experience? Yeah. And I've maybe found a few authors who've written about transgender youth experience, and they've maybe worked with transgender youth in the past, but that's where they're pulling their experience from. And I think it's sometimes helpful to know that, to know what their history is, who they've consulted, where they've got that information from.
I guess in a way it's almost like stating your sources a bit.
Yeah.
So knowing where your pool of information comes from.
Absolutely.
So I was just wondering, like, how about do you choose the books that you read at the book club?
Well, we've just been talking about representation, and I think that's something that's really come through to me, that Emily, right from the start, it became very clear to me that Emily worked really hard to make sure that there was a really wide range of books, not just in terms of genre, because that's also been really interesting. Is also I'd never read graphic novels before. I wasn't particularly into poetry, but we sort of read a bit of all sorts, including all different types of fiction and non-fiction. And I think that really shone through for me, which is probably why I've stayed so long, because Emily has worked so hard to make sure that you can see there's such a broad range to attract everybody. There's something for everybody in there.
So when we're planning our books for the next 6 months or a year, I usually start, well, we do two things. We do a call out to the people who come to our group or who are on our Facebook chat, see what books they know and can recommend. I think it's really helpful to have books that people are already saying are good books. Sometimes it's difficult when you look at a list on a bookshop, website, and you just have no idea if it's going to be a good book or not. So having those recommendations from people is really, really helpful. And the other thing that I usually do is I scroll through recommendations on the internet. So, for example, Kirsty earlier said we think there should be more representation of intersex characters. So I will particularly go and look for lists of books that have intersex characters in them. I'll maybe ask. We're really lucky to have a queer bookshop here in Leeds called Bookish Type, who are very open for me messaging them and saying, I want this kind of book, this kind of age range, what have you got for me? They will recommend books that are in stock and also go and find other books for me as well. And I think that's really helpful.
Yes. So I was just wondering, if I'm going to join the book club, do I have to be sort of like an avid reader?
No, we accept anyone who's read the book, is partway through, has got a couple of pages in, or even hasn't read the book at all. Our book sessions are about 45 minutes long, and we probably spend about 50% of the time talking about the book itself, and 50% about what our own personal experiences are. So, for example, when we talked about autobiography, which is about a bisexual young man, that then got me thinking about myself at that age, my own coming out stories and things like that. So it's about how you relate to the book as well. And I think even when you haven't read the book, you can still join in that conversation. Some people like coming along and just listening. I'm actually not a great reader if I don't click with a book straight away. Sometimes I've come to book club as the chair of the event and haven't read the book. So we're very relaxed and open-minded.
I think it actually works quite well as well if you often find that people like and dislike things from a book, and that makes for great conversation, because it's nice if you get one where everyone just says, oh, it was amazing, but you do tend to find that some of them are quite polarizing, so it does make for a more interesting debate and discussion, but a very friendly one.
So usually the book club meets at Leeds Central Library once a month. Obviously now, while coronavirus restrictions are in effect, we're meeting virtually by Zoom, but we do have a Facebook chat group that anyone can join by just going onto our Facebook page and finding the group. So if people don't want to come along to a physical group or aren't able to, there's also space on there to have a chat about the books, or even other books that you're reading. I often post and say, I've just read this book, these are my thoughts on it, and Kirsty usually writes up an anonymized version of the discussion we've had and post that as well, so people can then kind of comment on that with their thoughts.
So this is sort of final roundup question, which is, I said kind of early on that I'm very much a newbie when it comes to LGBT plus literature, and I was wondering, like, where do I start?
That's an interesting question. I guess it kind of depends on whether you if there's something in particular that you're interested in. So if there was perhaps whether it is a genre, so if you were into horror or crime or romance, then that's kind of a good starting point. And we've got quite a good list now of things that we've read and other authors that we're aware of, and access to that information. So it's I guess it kind of depends on what you're interested in but one thing I found personally is that sometimes it can, boring's not the right word, but sometimes if you do read the same type of book over and over, even though you love that sort of that genre and that it can start to become a little bit repetitive. And actually, through book club, I've read books that I never would have picked up off the shelf, and I've loved so many of them, and it's opened my sort of horizons up to so many different authors and types of book that I never would have thought that I would have liked a few years ago. So sometimes you kind of just have to take a bit of a punt and think, well, let's try it and see.
So our website also has a reading list on it for all of the books we've read. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to say whether we've liked the books or not. So they're not always, some of the books we have not enjoyed, and they're on the list as well. We've also got a list of the upcoming books on there also. For the book club, we do kind of say, even if people want to just dot in and out of it for the books that they fancy reading, it's not, you have to come every time. So if you wanted to check out the books on there and maybe find one that you fancy, that would maybe be a good place to start.
Well, I'd like to thank you both for answering all of my questions, and it was really good, really, really informative. So yeah, thank you.
It was nice chatting with you.
Thank you.